For centuries, archaeologists were puzzled by one of history's greatest mysteries. An entire civilization that built towering cliff palaces and flourished for generations simply vanished without a trace. But what if everything we thought we knew about their disappearance was wrong? What if they never vanished at all? This is the story of how science, combined with indigenous knowledge and cutting-edge genetics, finally revealed the truth about one of North America's most remarkable civilizations. This is the story of the ancestral Puebloans, and it's far more extraordinary than any legend or mystery that came before it. When European explorers first ventured into the American Southwest in the 16th century, they discovered something remarkable. Scattered across the desert landscape were the remains of extraordinary settlements. Massive stone structures rose from canyon walls. Multi-story dwellings carved into cliff faces suggested an advanced civilization with sophisticated architectural knowledge. Intricate pottery, advanced irrigation systems, and evidence of complex social organization painted a picture of a people who had achieved remarkable sophistication in one of North America's harshest environments. Yet the villages were abandoned. The cliff dwellings were empty. The great ceremonial centers stood silent. For hundreds of years, no one lived in these places. This absence sparked a question that would captivate archaeologists for generations. Where did they go? What catastrophic event could force an entire civilization to abandon their homes, their sacred sites, and their way of life? The mystery deepened with each passing decade as researchers uncovered more evidence of a thriving culture that simply ceased to exist. The ancestral Puebloans, also known by the Navajo term Anasazi, a word meaning ancient enemies, had inhabited the Four Corners region of the American Southwest for over 1,000 years. This area encompasses parts of present-day Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. The landscape is characterized by high desert plateaus, deep canyons, mesas, and arroyos that rise dramatically from the surrounding terrain. The climate is harsh and unforgiving with extreme temperature variations between seasons. Annual precipitation averages only 200 to 300 millimeters, primarily from late summer monsoons that are often unpredictable and inadequate for large-scale agriculture. Water is scarce. Groundwater is difficult to access. Rivers and streams flow inconsistently, disappearing for portions of the year or running dry during drought periods. The soil is challenging to cultivate and lacks the natural fertility found in other regions. Yet here, in this difficult and demanding environment, the ancestral Puebloans built one of North America's most sophisticated ancient civilizations. Their achievement becomes even more remarkable when we consider the environmental constraints they overcame. The civilization flourished from approximately 100 CE to the late 1300s, spanning over 12 centuries of continuous cultural development. During the peak of their cultural development, particularly between 800 and 1200 CE, often called the Great Pueblo period, the ancestral Puebloans accomplished remarkable feats of engineering, art, and social organization. They constructed massive multi-story adobe and stone buildings housing hundreds of people. They created intricate networks of roads that connected distant communities across vast distances, some extending for over 50 kilometers. These roads show evidence of sophisticated surveying and planning. They produced beautiful pottery decorated with complex geometric patterns and symbolic designs that conveyed spiritual and cultural meaning. They developed sophisticated agricultural techniques including terracing, irrigation systems, and floodwater farming that allowed them to grow maize, beans, and squash in the arid landscape. They understood seasonal patterns and constructed elaborate systems to harvest and store water for dry seasons. Their technological achievements were not limited to agriculture and construction. They understood astronomy and incorporated celestial knowledge into their architecture and ceremonial practices. The most iconic sites of their civilization tell stories of remarkable achievement. Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado contains some of the most impressive cliff dwellings ever built, with structures seemingly impossible to construct using only hand tools and without modern technology. Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico hosted the Great Houses, enormous multi-story structures that served as ceremonial and administrative centers. These buildings contained hundreds of rooms and were aligned with astronomical events including solstices and equinoxes, demonstrating sophisticated knowledge of the heavens. Pueblo Bonito, the largest great house in Chaco Canyon, contained approximately 600 rooms and was constructed with precision masonry that rivals modern building standards. The civilization was not unified under a single government or ruler. Instead, it consisted of interconnected communities with shared cultural practices, religious beliefs, and trade networks. The society had social hierarchies with elite groups who controlled trade and religious ceremonies. Kivas, underground ceremonial chambers, served as the heart of spiritual and social life in each community. These circular or rectangular structures were used for religious rituals, community meetings, and family gatherings. They remain sacred to Pueblo peoples today. Then, around 1300 CE, something changed. The evidence is unmistakable. Archaeological surveys show that the major population centers were abandoned. The cliff dwellings were no longer inhabited. The great houses of Chaco Canyon were emptied. By the end of the 1300s, the ancestral Puebloan civilization, as it had existed for over 1,000 years, had fundamentally transformed. The population dispersed. The centralized cultural centers were abandoned. The question that haunted archaeologists for centuries was simple but profound. What happened? For generations, scientists proposed theories ranging from the dramatic to the implausible. Some suggested warfare and invasion. Others proposed disease or famine. Some theorized environmental catastrophe or complete societal collapse. The most sensational theories included mysterious disappearances or supernatural events. Scholars debated endlessly. Hypotheses multiplied. Evidence was interpreted in different ways by different researchers. The mystery seemed almost unsolvable, lost to the mists of time and the silence of ancient ruins. But science has a way of revealing truth when we have the right tools and the right questions. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: trees. More specifically, it came from studying the rings of ancient trees, a scientific method called dendrochronology that revolutionized our understanding of ancestral Puebloan history. In the early 1900s, an astronomer named Andrew Ellicott Douglas was working at the Lowell Observatory in Arizona, studying sunspot cycles and their influence on Earth's climate. He noticed something remarkable while studying tree rings in Arizona. The width of each ring corresponds to the amount of rainfall that fell during that year. Wide rings indicate years with abundant moisture and good growing conditions. Narrow rings indicate drought years and environmental stress. The ring patterns are consistent across an entire region, allowing researchers to match rings from different trees and connect them across centuries. By studying patterns of rings across multiple trees and centuries, scientists could reconstruct a detailed climate history going back over 2,000 years. Douglas developed what he called the ancient tree ring calendar, a chronological framework that revolutionized archaeology. This dendrochronological technique became instrumental for dating archaeological sites with unprecedented precision. This ancient climate record held the key to understanding what happened to the ancestral Puebloans and providing evidence for the theories that scholars had developed over decades. The dendrochronological evidence revealed a startling pattern. Beginning around 1276 CE and lasting until approximately 1299 CE, the American Southwest experienced a megadrought of unprecedented severity. This megadrought was the most intense dry period documented in over 1,000 years of tree ring records for the region. Over this 23-year period, the region received dramatically less rainfall than normal. The tree ring records show that between 1275 and 1290, only 2 wet years occurred out of 16 years. This means 14 consecutive years of below normal precipitation. Stream flow in rivers and arroyos would have diminished dramatically. Soil moisture would have decreased year after year. Springs would have begun to run dry. The entire hydrological cycle of the region would have been disrupted. Imagine 23 years of persistent dry conditions affecting all aspects of life and survival. Imagine trying to farm in a desert that becomes even more arid than usual. Imagine your crops failing year after year without relief. Imagine your water sources drying up one by one. Imagine watching your livestock dying from thirst. Imagine the desperation of watching your civilization slowly suffocate under conditions of prolonged drought with no end in sight. This was not a single bad year that a society could weather. This was not a temporary hardship that could be endured. This was a catastrophic environmental event that lasted nearly a quarter century. For an agricultural civilization dependent on consistent rainfall for crop production, such a drought was existentially threatening. The ancestral Puebloans faced a simple choice: adapt or abandon their homeland. Agricultural production would have collapsed. The sophisticated irrigation systems they had built could not function without water. Crops would fail, food stores would deplete, famine would become reality. A population of tens of thousands would face starvation. The great houses that had taken generations to construct would become liabilities rather than assets. The centralized society that had functioned so effectively for centuries would fragment under the pressure of resource scarcity. But here is where the real story becomes even more fascinating. The ancestral Puebloans did not simply disappear or collapse into chaos. Instead, they demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptation to environmental stress. Recent research published in the journal Scientific Reports in 2020 revealed evidence that the ancestral Puebloans employed ingenious survival strategies during drought periods. Geoscientists led by researcher Bogdan Onak from the University of South Florida studied ice deposits and lava tubes in the El Malpais region of western New Mexico and discovered something extraordinary. The El Malpais region, which means Badlands in Spanish, is a landscape of dark volcanic rock and challenging terrain. Yet beneath this inhospitable surface lay a resource that could sustain people during times of environmental crisis. The ice deposits contained charred material indicating that the ancestral Puebloans had used fire to melt ancient ice to obtain drinking water, during periods of severe drought. Dating back as far as 150 CE through 950 CE, this evidence suggests that during multiple drought events spanning hundreds of years, the ancestral Puebloans traveled deep into caves where ice accumulated and used controlled fires to melt this ice for water. The radiocarbon dating of the charcoal provided precise evidence of when these activities occurred, allowing researchers to correlate human occupation of the caves with periods of drought documented in tree ring records. This was not a primitive or desperate measure in the sense of being ineffective or crude. This was sophisticated adaptation to environmental challenges requiring deep knowledge and planning. It demonstrates intimate knowledge of their landscape and underground geography. It shows understanding of where to find alternative water sources, even in an arid environment. It reveals capability to manage resources creatively and respond strategically to environmental stress. This survival strategy worked for centuries. The ancestral Puebloans adapted and persisted through earlier droughts. But the megadrought of the late 1200s was different. It was longer, more severe, and more comprehensive than earlier dry periods. The adaptive strategies that had worked before were insufficient for the scale of this environmental crisis. The ice in the caves could only support a limited population. Alternative food sources were insufficient. Migration became not just an option, but a necessity. So the ancestral Puebloans did what societies have done throughout human history when facing environmental catastrophe. They moved. They migrated to regions with more reliable water access and better agricultural conditions. They relocated to areas where streams flowed year-round and where rainfall patterns were more favorable. Over the course of several decades, the population dispersed from the Four Corners region. Some moved eastward to the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico. Others migrated to regions in Arizona, where the Hopi people established their settlements. Still others moved to areas where the Zuni developed their pueblos. The migration was not chaotic or sudden. It was a strategic response to environmental circumstances, likely planned and organized over years and decades. This is the crucial point that reframes the entire narrative about what happened to the ancestral Puebloans. The ancestral Puebloans did not vanish into thin air. They did not disappear mysteriously, leaving no trace. They did not collapse into societal chaos and disorder. They migrated, they reorganized, they adapted their settlement patterns and social structures to new environments. They maintained their cultural practices, their spiritual traditions, and their core identity even as they moved to new lands. And most importantly, they survived. They not only survived, but thrived, establishing new communities that would persist for centuries and continue through to the present day. The question that historians have asked for centuries has been answered by recent breakthrough research in genetics and population science. In April of 2025, groundbreaking research was published in the prestigious journal Nature that fundamentally changed our understanding of ancestral Puebloan history and migration patterns. A collaborative study led by the Picures Pueblo, a federally recognized Native American tribe based in northern New Mexico, worked with geneticists and archaeologists to analyze the DNA of ancient and modern Pueblo peoples. This collaboration represents a paradigm shift in how indigenous communities participate in scientific research about their own history. The researchers sequenced genomes from 16 ancient individuals who lived at Picures Pueblo between 1300 and 1500 CE. They compared these genetic sequences with 13 living members of the modern Picures Pueblo community. Advanced computational analysis identified patterns of ancestry connections. The results were definitive and profound. There was complete genetic continuity between ancient and modern populations with no genetic replacement. The people at Picures Pueblo today are direct descendants of the ancient Puebloans who lived there centuries ago. This is not tradition or cultural memory. This is biological fact supported by DNA evidence. But the study revealed something even more significant. The ancient Picures individuals showed genetic ties to people who had lived at Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, over 275 kilometers to the west. This genetic connection confirms what oral traditions of Pueblo peoples had maintained for centuries. The modern Picures Pueblo are descendants of people who migrated from Chaco Canyon. This is not speculation or hypothesis. This is genetic fact supported by modern scientific analysis. The study revealed another crucial finding that challenged earlier assumptions about ancestral Puebloan history. The researchers found no evidence of population decline before European arrival in North America. This contradicts earlier theories that suggested the ancestral Puebloan civilization had completely collapsed or disappeared. Instead, the genetic evidence shows continuity of population through all the centuries, from the ancient period into the modern era. The people persisted, the culture persisted, the lineages persisted. Furthermore, the genetic analysis revealed no Athabascan ancestry in individuals predating 1500 CE. This finding challenges earlier migration hypotheses that suggested populations from the north invaded and displaced Pueblo peoples. The genetic evidence clearly shows that the primary populations in the region from the time of the Great Houses through European contact were related to modern Pueblo peoples, not to northern populations. The story of invasion and conquest, while dramatic, was not supported by the genetic evidence. This collaborative study represents a watershed moment in archaeology and anthropology. For the first time, a federally recognized Native American tribe led a genomic study of its own ancestry rather than being the subject of research directed by external scientists. The Picuris Pueblo took control of their own narrative. They worked with geneticists to verify what their oral traditions had always maintained. They proved scientifically what they knew culturally. They are the direct descendants of the ancestral Puebloans of Chaco Canyon. The Picuris governor, Wayne Yaza, described the genetic findings as life-changing data. As he explained, the connection includes maternal lines transmitted through generations of women, highlighting the continuity of life and kinship through centuries of upheaval. Mothers passed their genes to children. Children became parents and passed those genes to the next generation. The unbroken chain of maternal inheritance connects modern Picuris to their ancient ancestors. This is not just history, this is family, this is life itself. The genetic breakthrough confirms what tree ring evidence suggested and what the migration theory proposed. The ancestral Puebloans did not vanish. They adapted. They moved. They reorganized their societies around new settlement patterns. They maintained their cultural identity while adjusting to new environments. Over centuries, through countless generations, they maintained continuity with their ancestors. The mega drought of the late 1200s was not the only factor that influenced the ancestral Puebloan migration, though it was undoubtedly the primary driver. Researchers have identified multiple contributing circumstances that likely work together to drive the reorganization of Pueblo society. The environmental stress of prolonged drought was the primary factor, but it did not exist in isolation from other social, political, and cultural forces. Social and political factors also influenced the decision to migrate and reorganize. The centralized political structures that had organized ancestral Puebloan society in places like Chaco Canyon may have become rigid and difficult to adapt to changing circumstances. The complex hierarchy that served the civilization well during periods of abundance and resource plenty may have become burdensome and inefficient when resources became scarce and competition intensified. Political tensions and conflicts between elite groups controlling trade networks and religious authority over sacred ceremonies likely intensified as resources dwindled and traditional systems broke down. Some scholars propose that political upheaval and cultural conflicts forced communities to abandon their traditional centers and reorganize in new regions. The authority structures that had worked for centuries lost their effectiveness in crisis circumstances. Religious and spiritual factors were undoubtedly significant as well in driving migration decisions. The ancestral Puebloans maintained sophisticated spiritual beliefs connected intimately to their landscape. Sacred sites held deep religious and ceremonial meaning. The kivas were not merely ceremonial centers built for religious ritual. They were the spiritual heart of communities, the place where spiritual and physical worlds connected. When environmental circumstances made it impossible to maintain traditional settlement patterns and agricultural practices, the spiritual meaning of the entire landscape changed. Communities had to reimagine their relationship to sacred geography. They had to develop new rituals and practices adapted to new environments. This was not merely a physical migration of populations from one place to another. This was a spiritual and cultural transformation, requiring adaptation of belief systems and practices. Archaeological evidence also suggests that warfare or conflict may have contributed to population movements in some regions. Some sites show evidence of defensive structures and possible violence. However, this was likely not the primary driver of the large-scale migration. Instead, environmental stress created conditions where conflict became more likely. Competition for scarce resources increased. Tensions between communities escalated. Migration became a way to relieve these pressures by dispersing populations to regions with greater resource availability. The remarkable aspect of the ancestral Pueblo and migration is that it was not a collapse followed by disappearance. It was a reorganization. The civilization transformed its settlement patterns. Populations dispersed to new regions. Cultural practices adapted to new environments. But the fundamental identity and continuity of the culture persisted. The people who migrated from Chaco Canyon carried their traditions, their knowledge, and their cultural practices to their new homes. Over generations, they developed new communities while maintaining connection to their past. The descendants of the ancestral Puebloans did not remain isolated after migration. They maintained trade networks and cultural connections across the region. Archaeological evidence shows that communities that descended from different ancestral Puebloan centers maintained contact and exchange. They shared knowledge about agricultural techniques adapted to their new environments. They exchanged pottery styles and artistic traditions. They maintained religious and spiritual connections. The modern Pueblo peoples, including the Hopi, Zuni, Rio Grande Pueblos, and many others, represent the direct cultural and biological descendants of the ancestral Puebloans. The term Anasazi, used for over a century to describe this ancient civilization, is now recognized as inappropriate and disrespectful. The word is Navajo in origin and translates as ancient enemies or ancient strangers, terms that carry negative connotations. Modern Pueblo peoples, who are the descendants of this civilization, prefer the term ancestral Puebloans. This term recognizes the direct relationship between the ancient civilization and modern Pueblo communities. It respects the living descendants and their claim to this history. The terminology shift reflects a broader movement in archaeology and anthropology toward respecting indigenous perspectives and honoring the continuity between ancient and modern indigenous peoples. The oral traditions of modern Pueblo peoples had always maintained narratives of migration and movement from ancestral homelands. Pueblo cultures include stories of journeys and relocations that shape their identity and spiritual practices. These oral histories were sometimes dismissed by earlier scholars as mythology or cultural memory rather than historical fact. But the genetic evidence now confirms that these oral traditions carry historical truth. The Pueblo peoples have been maintaining accurate historical narratives for centuries, passed down through generations in the form of stories, ceremonies, and cultural practices. Modern science has simply verified what Pueblo peoples always knew. This convergence of scientific evidence and indigenous knowledge represents a paradigm shift in how archaeology and anthropology approach the study of ancient cultures. Rather than external scientists studying indigenous peoples from a distance, collaborative research methods involve indigenous communities as equal partners in the research process. The control of indigenous data, including genetic information, is placed in the hands of indigenous peoples themselves. The knowledge systems of indigenous peoples are recognized as valid and valuable alongside Western scientific methods. The result is a richer, more accurate, and more respectful understanding of human history. The implications of this research extend far beyond the specific history of the ancestral Puebloans and their ancient civilization. The study of how the ancestral Puebloans adapted to and survived the megadrought of the late 1200s offers critically important lessons for the modern world currently facing climate change and environmental uncertainty. The ancestral Puebloans developed sophisticated strategies for living in an arid environment despite limited technological resources. They understood water management and irrigation systems. They understood agriculture in difficult conditions and how to maximize productivity with minimal water. They understood how to respond to environmental stress through adaptation, reorganization, and strategic relocation. They understood how to maintain cultural continuity through periods of dramatic change. As the modern world faces increasing environmental challenges driven by climate change and human activities, these lessons from ancient peoples become increasingly relevant. Scholars and policymakers are increasingly turning to indigenous knowledge and historical examples of adaptation to inform modern responses to environmental crisis. The ancestral Puebloans also demonstrate the resilience of human societies. They faced circumstances that could have destroyed their civilization. The megadrought lasted over 2 decades and devastated agriculture across the region. Yet they did not collapse into chaos. They organized a systematic migration to regions with better conditions. They maintained their cultural identity while adapting to new circumstances. They built new communities and developed new settlement patterns while preserving their traditions. This resilience in the face of environmental catastrophe offers a model for modern societies facing their own challenges. Furthermore, the story of the ancestral Puebloans challenges assumptions about progress and the inevitability of cultural collapse. Western civilization often frames history as a linear progression from primitive to advanced societies. The disappearance of ancient civilizations is sometimes interpreted as failure or collapse. But the ancestral Puebloans demonstrate a different model. They did not fail, they adapted, they reorganized, they persisted. Their migration was not a retreat, but a strategic response to environmental circumstances. Their cultural identity was not destroyed, but transformed and adapted to new contexts. This is not failure. This is success through adaptation. The genetic research published in April 2025 has sparked renewed interest in ancestral Puebloan history among both scholars and the general public. Major museums and archaeological sites are reconsidering how they present this history to visitors. Educational materials are being updated to reflect the new understanding that the ancestral Puebloans migrated rather than vanished. Pueblo communities are working with archaeologists and geneticists to tell their stories in ways that center indigenous perspectives and knowledge. The significance of ancestral Puebloan achievement extends to modern sustainable and environmental practices. Indigenous agricultural techniques developed by ancestral Puebloans and refined by their descendants remain effective and sustainable in arid environments. Modern scholars of sustainable agriculture increasingly recognize the value of traditional Pueblo farming methods. Techniques like terracing, floodwater farming, and irrigation systems developed by ancestral Puebloans demonstrate sophisticated understanding of water management and soil conservation. These techniques are being studied and adapted for use in modern sustainable agriculture as humanity seeks ways to produce food while minimizing environmental impact. The architecture of ancestral Puebloans also receives renewed attention for its sustainable and adaptive design. The cliff dwellings were constructed to maximize thermal efficiency and minimize heat loss during winter, while providing natural cooling during summer. The orientation of great houses aligned with solar and celestial events, suggesting sophisticated understanding of astronomy and seasonal patterns. The use of local materials and traditional construction methods resulted in structures that required minimal ongoing maintenance and had minimal environmental impact. Modern architects and builders are increasingly studying ancestral Puebloan architecture for insights into sustainable building practices. So let us return to where we began, to the question that puzzled archaeologists for centuries. What happened to the ancestral Puebloans? We now know the answer. They did not vanish mysteriously. They did not collapse into oblivion. They did not disappear without explanation. They faced an environmental crisis of unprecedented proportions. A mega drought lasting over 20 years devastated the agricultural systems that supported their civilization. Rather than collapse, they adapted. They reorganized their societies. They migrated to regions with more reliable water and better conditions for agriculture. They maintained their cultural identity and spiritual traditions. They persisted. The ancestral Puebloans survived through ingenuity, adaptation, and resilience. Their descendants, the modern Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest, carry forward the traditions, knowledge, and cultural practices of their ancestors. The genetic evidence confirms what the oral traditions maintained. The people persisted. The culture persisted. The identity persisted. The mystery that captivated archaeologists for generations was not a mystery of disappearance, but a story of remarkable human adaptation to environmental challenge. This is not just ancient history. This is the story of how humans respond to catastrophe. This is the story of how cultures survive and adapt. This is the story of how knowledge passes from generation to generation. This is the story of how oral traditions preserve historical truth. This is the story of how modern science, when combined with indigenous knowledge and respectful collaboration, reveals deeper truths about human history. And this is the story that will inspire generations to come as they face their own challenges and seek examples of human resilience, adaptability, and persistence. The ancestral Puebloans did not vanish. They lived, they adapted, they survived. And their descendants continue their legacy today, maintaining traditions and knowledge that have persisted for over 2,000 years in the challenging landscape of the American Southwest. This is their story. This is our story. This is the story of human resilience in the face of environmental change.